July 18th, 1944. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but Normandy still smelled like wet earth and cordite, like a battlefield that refused to dry out. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood inside a dim command post, maps pinned to boards, radio chatter rising and falling like a fever. On the table in front of him sat casualty reports from the American sector, pages that felt heavier than any steel helmet. 6 weeks after the landings, the Allied invasion was supposed to be breathing, expanding, turning into a surge toward Paris. Instead, Bradley's First Army was trapped in a green maze where every field was a fortress and every hedgerow was a wall built by time itself. The words on the paper were cold and clean, but the reality behind them was anything but. Over 40,000 casualties since D-Day. Killed, wounded, missing. The number looked unreal until he remembered how many times he had watched replacements arrive with fresh faces, only for those faces to vanish into the hedgerows and never return. The bocage did not fight like a normal place. It fought like an ambush. The terrain was a weapon. Narrow lanes sank between ancient banks, the banks topped with thick vegetation and roots so old they could grip a tank and hold it like a hand around a throat. Visibility died at 10 yards. Sound traveled strange, muffled by leaves, then suddenly loud when a machine gun opened and the world snapped into panic. German defenders did not need to move fast. They needed only to wait. Every American advance became a slow walk into a trap that might already be set. A trap that might not reveal itself until a squad leader stepped forward and the hedgerow exploded with fire. Bradley read each line twice. Then he looked up at the map and felt the anger return, the kind of anger that had nowhere safe to go. Because the worst part was not what his men were facing in front of them. The worst part was that this hell had been avoidable. It had been avoidable if a single promise had been kept. If one city, only a few miles to the east, had been taken when it was supposed to be taken. Caen. The name was short, almost harmless, yet it had become the hinge of the entire invasion. Caen was the road junction. Montgomery had promised to seize on the first day. Caen was the open ground beyond it, the tank country, the space where Allied armor could run, and German defense would crack under pressure and speed. Caen was the key that was supposed to unlock Normandy. And Caen was still not fully Allied territory. The quiet truth no one wanted to say aloud in public meetings was simple. The Americans were bleeding in the hedgerows because the British were stuck outside Caen. Bernard Montgomery had promised Eisenhower that Caen would fall on D-Day itself, and that promise had shaped the entire Overlord plan. British and Canadian forces would land on the eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, and push toward Caen, taking it quickly to open the door inland. American forces would land at Utah and Omaha, push through the Cotentin, secure Cherbourg for logistics. Both roles mattered, but one was supposed to be the spearhead into open country. If Caen fell fast, Normandy would open like a door. If Caen did not fall, Normandy would turn into a vice. Bradley's eyes drifted to the right edge of the map. 6 miles. That was the distance between promise and reality. 6 miles that had cost thousands of American lives. June 6th, 1944. The first day. The day the plan was supposed to work like clockwork. The British and Canadians landed successfully. They did not face the kind of slaughter the Americans endured at Omaha. Their beachheads held. Their troops moved inland. For a few hours, everything looked like momentum. The path to Caen was vulnerable, German forces thin in places, the city within reach. And then came the pause. Small, rational, deadly. Consolidation, logistics, artillery, Supply lines? Caution. Caution was what Normandy punished. German reinforcements arrived like a closing fist. The 21st Panzer Division counterattacked between British and Canadian sectors, not to throw them into the sea, but to cut rhythm, to slow the push, to buy hours. By nightfall, Caen had not fallen. Montgomery's promise was already broken. But Montgomery told Eisenhower it was temporary. Tomorrow, within days. The words sounded confident. The map stayed the same. June 7, 1944. Attacks, resistance, no breakthrough. June 8th, same. June 9th, same. By June 10th, 4 days after the landings, Montgomery's original timetable was dead. Caen was not a victory to be claimed on schedule. It was turning into a grind. And a grind in Normandy was not just a British problem. It was an Allied problem. Because every day the British stayed pinned outside Caen was another day the Germans could shape the rest of the front the way they wanted. In German headquarters, decisions were being made with the calm of professionals who understood exactly what was at stake. Erwin Rommel had limited armored reserves. He could not be strong everywhere. He had to choose where the armor mattered most. Caen mattered. If the British broke through there, they would reach open ground and threaten operational collapse. The Americans in the West were stuck in terrain that looked, to German eyes, like slow fighting. The bocage was a trap for attackers and a gift to defenders. So Rommel concentrated. Tanks moved toward Caen. Elite units arrived. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr. More formations that could have crushed the invasion if used at the right time, now committed to holding the British at the gate. Years later, Montgomery would claim this was intentional, that he had fixed German armor around Caen like a pin holding a butterfly in place. But in June, he did not speak like a man executing a trap. He spoke like a man trying to break through and failing. His offensives were not feints. They were full-force punches aimed at cracking the German line. While he punched, Bradley's men bled. American infantry advanced across open fields toward hedgerows they could not see through. Machine guns opened from unseen positions. Mortars fell without warning. German defenders used the banks and vegetation like armor. American tanks tried to help, but the hedgerows punished them. When a Sherman climbed, its belly lifted, exposed, and German anti-tank gunners waited for that moment, like hunters waiting for a deer to step into a clearing. In the bocage, American advantages in armor and air power shrank. The battle became personal and close. It became the kind of war where a single field could cost a company half its strength. By early July, the casualty reports became a steady flood. Bradley's divisions were being ground down. Replacements arrived, inexperienced, learning by dying. The Americans were paying time and blood for a campaign that should have moved faster. Bradley understood what that meant strategically. If the Allies did not break out soon, Germany would have time to strengthen defenses, to reinforce, to turn Normandy into a long attritional struggle. And attrition was not the plan. The plan was speed. June 26, 1944. Operation Epsom began, another British offensive west of Caen, aimed at outflanking and breaking through. Heavy artillery, infantry, tanks. It looked like the kind of overwhelming force that should have ended the argument, but the German defense held with stubborn skill. The British gained ground in places, but not freedom of maneuver. The offensive stalled. The battlefield became again what Normandy had become. Progress measured in yards, paid for in lives. As days passed, pressure mounted. Churchill watched and fumed. British newspapers questioned. Eisenhower balanced diplomacy with necessity, but privately he needed results. Meetings grew tense. Montgomery promised another offensive, bigger, heavier, with bombers. Operation Goodwood. This time, he said, the breakthrough would happen. July 18, 1944. The date on Bradley's casualty report. The same day, Goodwood began. Over 2,000 bombers dropped thousands of tons of bombs east of Caen, the ground shaking like it was being torn open. Then, British armored divisions advanced, hundreds of tanks, a mass of steel meant to smash what stubborn infantry and artillery could not. For a few hours, the reports sounded hopeful. The German forward positions had been devastated. British armor moved. Optimism surged. Montgomery sent encouraging messages. The breakthrough was happening. It felt like the moment that might finally justify the promises made on D-Day. And then the German defense revealed the part the bombers had not destroyed. Hidden guns, surviving strong points. Villages turned into kill zones. 88mm guns waited and fired from concealment. German armor shifted into defensive positions. British tanks advanced into overlapping fire and began to burn. The momentum slowed. The lines stiffened. The battlefield swallowed optimism the way the bocage swallowed squads, quietly, efficiently, without mercy. By the end of the day, Goodwood had not broken the German line. It had only moved it slightly, at terrible cost. By July 20th, 1944, Goodwood was halted. Montgomery called it a success anyway. He spoke of ground gained, Germans hurt, positions improved. But Eisenhower knew what the words could not hide. There was no decisive breakthrough. The German defense still stood. The eastern door was still not open the way Overlord had demanded. It was after Goodwood that the story began to change. Not on the battlefield, but in the language commanders used. Montgomery began suggesting that his real purpose had been to hold German armor in place, to bleed it, to prevent it from moving west to crush the Americans. In this story, Caen had been a magnet by design. Every German tank trapped in the east was one less tank in the bocage. Montgomery's failure became strategy. His delay became intent. Bradley heard this and felt something colder than anger. Because Bradley remembered the promises. He remembered the planning. Caen was supposed to be taken quickly because the whole Allied front needed that space. Nobody had planned for 6 weeks of hedgerow slaughter as a necessary stage. Nobody had sold that to the men who stormed the beaches. And now, as American casualties climbed, Montgomery was trying to take control of the narrative, turning broken timetables into planned outcomes. Eisenhower could not openly challenge Montgomery without risking coalition fracture. In public, unity mattered. But privately, Eisenhower's confidence in Montgomery was damaged. More importantly, Eisenhower's operational decisions began to shift. The Americans would have to force the breakout themselves. The invasion could not be held hostage to a story. Bradley had been planning the American breakout for weeks. Operation Cobra. A massive bombardment near St. Lo, a narrow strip where the Germans could be smashed, communications shattered, and the line torn open. Then, American ground forces would punch through and flood into open country. It was a gamble, because bombardment could go wrong, because German resistance could stiffen, because the bocage could swallow momentum again. But there was no other way. Normandy had to open. Bradley had one advantage, even if it came from British failure. German armor remained heavily committed around Caen. The Germans could not easily shift 7 panzer divisions west without risking collapse in the east. If Cobra struck hard and then moved fast, it might escape before German tanks could arrive. American soldiers, meanwhile, learned to fight the terrain itself. They welded steel onto Sherman tanks, improvised cutters that could rip through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. Rhino tanks, ugly, practical, born from desperation. In Normandy, desperation was a kind of engineer, but even Rhino tanks were not enough if the breakout paused. Speed was the true weapon. Once the German line cracked, someone had to drive the wedge deeper, refusing to stop, refusing to consolidate, refusing to grant the enemy time. Bradley knew exactly who that was. George S. Patton. Patton had been waiting in the shadows of controversy since Sicily, kept out of the spotlight, kept out of command, then quietly returned because Eisenhower and Bradley understood something that could not be said too loudly. When the battlefield demanded movement, Patton was the man who turned movement into collapse. Patton's Third Army would become operational on August 1st, 1944, but Patton had already been studying Normandy, already planning exploitation routes, already imagining what the war could look like once the hedgerows were behind him. July 25th, 1944. Cobra began. Bombers struck German positions near St. Lo, heavy and medium aircraft dropping thousands of tons of bombs on a narrow corridor of front line. The earth churned, defenses disintegrated. Survivors stumbled and tried to regroup. Then American infantry attacked into the chaos. The first hours were confusion and fear, but it was German confusion now, not American. Resistance became sporadic. The line began to crack. By July 26th and July 27th, the gap widened. More American divisions pushed through. German attempts to counterattack lacked coordination and strength. The defenses in western Normandy began to collapse in a way the Germans had feared since the first day. By July 28, 1944, American forces were breaking into open country beyond the bocage. Tank country, maneuver space. Air power could strike clearly. Armor could move. The war could finally become what Allied planners had intended. The feeling among American commanders was not celebration. It was relief mixed with fury. They had fought for weeks in the hedgerows because Caen had not opened the door. Now, the Americans were forcing their own door open. The Germans tried to respond, rushing reinforcements from Brittany, shifting units, sealing gaps. But their best armored formations were still tied near Caen. Their choices were limited. Their timing was late. The breakthrough became a flood. And then, as July turned to August, the most dangerous moment arrived. Not for the Germans, not yet, but for the politics of the alliance. Because once the breakout happened, the question was not only who would win Normandy, the question was who would claim the victory, and who would carry the blame for the cost that came before it. August 1st, 1944. Patton's Third Army became operational. Official orders emphasized Brittany and ports. Patton looked at the strategic reality and saw that the plan was already outdated. The German army in Normandy was cracking. Speed could turn retreat into disaster. Patton did not talk like a man content to follow the slow path. He moved like a man racing time itself. He sent forces west to satisfy the written order. But he drove the heart of his army east, toward the Seine, toward Paris, toward the German border. Once Patton began to move, stopping him became almost impossible. Not because Eisenhower had no authority, but because Patton's speed created a new reality on the map faster than anyone could rewrite the plan. Towns were liberated in rapid succession. German columns were cut off. Retreat routes were severed. Patton's reconnaissance found weak points and exploited them before German commanders even understood where the front had shifted. In 2 weeks, Patton advanced distances that made the previous 6 weeks look like a different war. And that is when Montgomery's new story became a weapon. He began claiming that the American breakout was possible because he had held German armor at Caen, that Cobra, Patton, and the liberation of France were the payoff of Montgomery's master plan. He had fixed German panzers. He had drawn them in. He had bled them. He had created conditions. Bradley and Patton were furious, not because they denied that German armor had been held near Caen, but because they knew why. It had been held there because the British kept attacking Caen and could not break through, because Caen mattered, because Montgomery had promised to take it quickly and failed, and because that failure had trapped American forces in the bocage long enough for casualties to climb into the tens of thousands. As Patton's columns raced east, the contrast became undeniable. One general had spent weeks in costly, limited advances. Another turned a crack into a runaway collapse. Montgomery had promised a breakthrough at Caen on D-Day and never delivered it on schedule. Patton did what was supposed to happen in June. Only he did it in August, because he had to repair a timetable already shattered. After the war, German generals would confirm what American commanders suspected. They had concentrated armor around Caen because the British attacks looked like real breakthrough attempts. They were not fooled by a deception story. They were responding to pressure where pressure was applied. Goodwood, especially, convinced them the British were trying to break out. If anything, the Germans were surprised not by Montgomery's genius, but by his inability to convert enormous effort into decisive maneuver. The Americans, by contrast, shocked them with speed once the breakthrough occurred. The truth behind Normandy was not comfortable for alliance politics, but it was clear in the casualty lists Bradley held on July 18, 1944. American divisions were worn down in the bocage while Caen remained contested. Men died in hedgerow ambushes while commanders argued over promises, plans, and narratives. When the breakout finally came, it came through American force and American adaptation, and then it became unstoppable through American speed. Montgomery's broken promise at Caen did not help in the way his later story claimed. It created a crisis. It delayed momentum. It magnified casualties. It forced the Americans to rebuild the campaign around their own breakout plan. And when that plan succeeded, Montgomery's quickest move was not on the battlefield. It was in the story, claiming that the delay had been intent. But Bradley had read too many casualty reports to accept that. He knew what it meant when a plan depended on speed, and speed was lost. He knew what it meant when men died for weeks in hedgerows because space never opened. And he knew that if Patton had not been unleashed at the right moment, if exploitation had been cautious, if movement had been delayed, if the breakout had been consolidated, the Germans might have recovered enough to drag Normandy back into stalemate. Instead, Patton drove forward, and the war changed shape in a matter of days. The question was never whether Caen mattered. The question was, who would admit what Caen had cost? And on that wet evening in Normandy, with radios buzzing and maps shifting and casualty lists thick as a book, Omar Bradley understood something that would haunt the rest of the campaign. Normandy had been saved not by the plan as written, but by the plan rebuilt under pressure. Rebuilt by Americans who could no longer afford to wait for promises to become reality.